I will never look at parakeets the same way, Jade. You know, there's like this weird history of murderous parakeets in films. You wouldn't think of it because a parakeet's like, parakeet, just that little bird, you know, just flying around. But there's like, I don't know, 2 movies that I've seen like recently where they've had like a murderous parakeet. And I just wanted to bring up, it's like these movies have like barely anything in common. Oh, well, to a degree. But like A Nightmare on Elm Street, Part 2, Freddy's Revenge. There's like a murderous parakeet in that movie. And I was like, oh, wow, look at that. Kind of these movies nearly like back to back. And they both feature like, well, this features like a lot of murderous parakeets. But this one is like that one too. We're going to go ahead and we're going to move on to the next part of my show. And that is my review for The Boy and the Heron. The latest film, possibly the last film from acclaimed filmmaker Hayao Miyazaki. And for people who need a bit of a background, a synopsis for the movie. Initially starting in 1943, a young boy named Mahito tragically loses his mother in a hospital fire, which in turn hardens him to life. Several years later, his father remarries and moves the family to the countryside. And while Mahito struggles to adjust to his new life, he also discovers a mystical world thanks to a talking heron. First of all, I want to talk about, Studio Ghibli or more specifically, the works of Hayao Miyazaki. I have seen all, if not most of his movies. And, I consider myself a big fan of his filmography. There are some films that I certainly prefer over others, of course. But, some of my favorites have always been Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind, Castle in the Sky, also known as Laputa, Spirited Away. My absolute favorite film of his to this day is Princess Mononoke. I think that movie is a masterpiece. It made me cry the first time I saw it, and it's definitely in my top 10 favorite films of all time. Not top 10, animated films, no, favorite films. I absolutely adore that movie. I think it's perfect. Now, when it comes to the Boy and the Heron, first of all, it is such a pleasure seeing a 2D animated movie in a theatrical setting. It's become an extremely rare viewing experience in the West, especially, here in the United States, since so many American and Western animation studios solely make 3D animated theatrical films. Yes, there is an occasional re-release of a classic like Disney animated movie from the Renaissance era, like, Lion King or Aladdin, mostly, kind of drove excitement for their latest remake of that film, right? But it's mostly just 3D animated movies. It's been great to see, though, the proliferation of the 2.5D style that's been recently popularized thanks to Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, and we've seen it kind of carry on into other fantastic films. Some of my other favorite films of the 2020s, such as Mitchell's vs. the Machines. Also kind of seen a more asymmetrical animation style in recent films like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Mutant Mayhem. But again, that kind of asymmetrical animation style, that 2.5D animation style, it's still in its infancy, right now. Also, DreamWorks. I have to mention DreamWorks, what they did with, Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. Really like that they did with that film, and I hope they apply that animation style to their future films, such as, Shrek 5 and some of the original works. But for right now, that type of asymmetrical animation style in the 2.5D, it's still very young. It's still in its infancy, but I think we are going to see it blow up and proliferate across multiple other Western studios in the next few years. So again, seeing a film like The Boy and the Heron in a theater is really special. It's a very special kind of experience for me. And, I gotta say, this movie is filled with that classical visual splendor that we typically expect from Hayao Miyazaki. We have a wonderfully rich landscapes that are filled with color, personality, and just a sense of history. From every moss-covered stone and log to the scattered lily pads sitting in a pond, it's obvious that so much thought was put into the visual splendor of the environments, and that's even before we get to the fantastical world in this film that's filled with so much fantasy and even like dark fantasy elements. You just feel so cozy watching a Miyazaki movie like this. And, it can elicit, I think, so many emotions from people, nostalgia, certainly, watching these films when you're growing up here in America, during the 90s, but even just, watching a new Hayao Miyazaki movie every other decade when he puts out a new one, it's just like, oh, wow. You just get like I always get like a nice sense of warmth from a lot of these types of viewing experiences because they're exceedingly rare. Now I have to say this, I saw the dub version of the film, and a sub version is also available in cinemas right now, but I often like Studio Ghibli's dubs because they get some really talented people to lend their voices to their films. I mean, for this film in particular, everyone from Christian Bale to Mark Hamill, Gemma Chan, Florence Pugh, Dave Bautista, Willem Dafoe are all great in this movie. I was like, yeah, these people all nail it across the board, in my opinion. And I'm so glad. Also, it's just great to see someone like, a Dave Bautista who continues to, just take really interesting roles. I think he's finally moved past the whole, it's like, oh, isn't it impressive that he did this movie because he was a wrestler and yada, yada, yada. It's like, he's no longer like that. He is an actor, and he is a great actor, chat. I'm just waiting I think we're all waiting now for like when's he going to finally get some award attention for a number of his roles, because he's been fantastic. Even if the movie I didn't even particularly care for all that much earlier this year, he was excellent in was that M. Night Shyamalan movie, Knock at the Cabin. He was so good in that film. And again, he is great here. But honestly, it's Robert Pattinson who's the standout for me. He is the voice of the Heron in the film. And watching it and listening to his voice, you cannot tell that it's him in the movie. It's like you can like, oh yeah, I can, yeah, that's Dave Bautista, sure, that's definitely Florence Pugh, but he is actually playing a character. Robert Pattinson's actually playing a character and voice acting in this film, and he's unrecognizable and continues just his winning streak as an actor, taking on very different characters from himself. So many people still to this day are like, oh, yeah, the vampire guy from Twilight, the guy that sparkles. It's like people that like keep harping on that, keep bringing that up. It's like, you clearly have not seen all of his other like recent works that he's been doing for what, the past 10 years. Everything from like more recent films like The Batman to The Lighthouse. There's so many films that he's done, whether it be smaller films or much bigger pictures. Even a movie I don't like Tenet. I really despise Tenet. He's the best thing in the movie. He's the only one that has any personality in that film. Anytime Robert Pattinson shows up in the movie, I'm like, ooh, what's he going to be this time? You never know with him, which is really exciting. That's what makes his performances so great, because you don't know exactly what you're going to get from him, and this is very much the case here. You can see why Studio Ghibli picked him, because it's like, oh, this guy's not just going to do his regular voice. He's gonna play a radically different character than what he's played in the past. And so my non-existent hat is certainly off to him for taking on this role. And so. The animation, of course, in this movie is absolutely stunning. It's beautiful. The characters are all well voice acted. The dub, that is. That's what I saw. I can't speak to the sub, obviously. And, and very interesting. But, people are asking, so what about the story and the themes? And I will say this. I think the theme of this movie is grief and how we choose to grapple with our inner conflicts. All of that I think is realized and shown in the character of Mahito, who is not a happy person, who is bitter often resentful and angry in the film, which, thinking about like a lot of Studio Ghibli, but even Hayao Miyazaki protagonists, that's not often the case. Like, you think of like Prince Ashitaka from Princess Mononoke, certainly serious, but I would not describe him as bitter at all or an angry character. Obviously, Nazca in the Valley of the Wind, she's a very hopeful person. Same with the protagonists in Castle in the Sky. Like most of the time, most of the characters that we follow, the main leads, the heroes in a lot of his movies, have a very positive outlook on life. And yes, they do go up against much adversity in their adventures, and it makes it exciting. And they definitely have maybe their darker moments, but through most of the films, they have a very positive outlook. Like this is like one of the first ones that I can like think of where it's like, okay, this is a character who is not in a good place in their life, who is very angry, and for obvious reasons. I think maybe that might be like a turnoff to some people, especially like what this character does. But I found it like, oh, this is interesting that Miyazaki did not go down the same road when it came to like his protagonist. Like the character of Mahito, like he expresses himself in very unhealthy ways, and often towards people who are not deserving of his malice. He goes on this fantastical journey via this sealed tower in the woods, right? And meets a variety of allies and villains who force him to confront his behavior. More importantly, his grief in the movie over the loss of his mother and her being replaced by another woman, right? And this effectively like allows him to move on and transform into a better person because of his experiences throughout the film. He goes through the most profound change in the movie, which maybe that's a critique you can throw at maybe some of Miyazaki's other films, is that maybe a number of his protagonists don't go through a profound amount of change, since they always seemingly have like a very positive outlook. But maybe they learn some lessons along the way. Of course, but like this, of all the characters across his movies, of all of his main characters, Mahito is certainly the one that goes through the most growth and most change throughout his journey, because of his experiences, very arduous experiences. Now, the story itself to the movie, I do think it can be a little overwhelming at times, and they do throw a lot of mystical fantasy babble at you, especially when they try to explain the existence of this fantasy world that Mahito finds, via this talking heron, and what made it what it was, which I was kind of surprised by, because, I personally figured it would probably be better not to explain or really over-explain your fantasy world, because then people, when you're watching the movie, would start questioning, like, how is all this working based on this element that you said happened? I think that in the movie was unnecessary. However, despite maybe the confusing like origins of like, okay, how is all this working and happening? How did this come to be? The world itself and the characters that occupy it, that live within it, are, I think, all very interesting and fun, and in some cases, quite terrifying. I will never look at parakeets the same way, Jade. There's like this weird history of murderous parakeets in films. You wouldn't think of it, because a parakeet's like, parakeet, just that little bird, just flying around. But there's like, I don't know, 2 movies that I've seen like recently, obviously, The Boy and the Heron being one of those films, where they've had like a murderous parakeet. And I just wanted to bring up, it's like these movies have like barely anything in common. Oh, well, to a degree. But like A Nightmare on Elm Street, Part 2, Freddy's Revenge, there's like a murderous parakeet in that movie. And I was like, oh, wow, look at that. Kind of these movies nearly like back to back, and they both feature like, well, this features like a lot of murderous parakeets, but this one is like that one too, where it tried to murder that entire family that occupied, that Freddy Krueger's old house. I was like, but again, it's just so crazy that both those films kind of back to back. But I did like that things that you would ordinarily not see as threatening in real life, they actually make threatening in this fantasy world. And I thought that was very cool. And I think because of that, because all that stuff is there and it's all very imaginative and just absolutely stunningly gorgeous looking, you won't be questioning then, like, okay, how is all this actually working? Because you'll just be so immersed in the personalities that are on screen. Another bit of a criticism, the pacing of the movie might also not work for everyone. It definitely takes its time in the first third to build up the characters, show them in their everyday life, before we get to the fantasy aspects. Eastern and Western animation is different in terms of pacing, I found. Eastern animation has been known to, I think, take its time. They treat animation, they treat it as a medium for everyone, and not just for kids. While, over here in the West, it's typically like, oh, it's made for kids first and adults second. Certainly when it comes to theatrical animation, I think that's, true, mostly true. And, Japanese animation, certainly for some theatrical productions, it's not as frantic or as constantly moving in the beginning. But I don't mind that personally. I want more adult animated fare in the West on a regular basis. And I think the film succeeds more than it stumbles when it comes to that pacing or storytelling. I like learning about Mahito and his family and the circumstances that brought them to this new place, in their lives. Obviously, World War II dominates the movie, that you always kind of feel it in the background since you had such a profound effect, such a profoundly negative effect on the family, right? And so I think it's always interesting. I always like to see, what is a Japanese perspective in, World War II? It's like, thankfully there's a lot of material out now that we can kind of see that. It's much more accessible, because, typically here in the West, here in America, we're always seeing the American perspective, always seeing kind of the Allied perspective on things. And so to see that, that's, especially for, civilians, Japanese civilians, it's very interesting. And so I didn't mind that the film kind of took its time to showcase this family and their friends and the new environment which they have to, live in. Especially because you got all these other wonderful supporting characters. You have all these grandmas in the movie too. You have all these maids that work at this estate. And everything that they were doing was just so kind of weird and crazy. And I think, very funny. Found it very amusing. So much of Miyazaki's movies, there is a beauty to them. There's this wonderful natural beauty, but there is also this ugliness that he incorporates into everything. It's like, oh, it's a beautiful landscape, but then there'll be that really kind of fucked up looking ugly creature or plant or monstrosity or whatever. It's like, what is that thing? And it's very much the case in this movie, and it's very much the case of a lot of the supporting characters. Even some of the human characters, like, what happened to you? And I like that. And that's even the beginning of the movie. That's even before we get to the fantasy world. So I like that stuff. It's almost, I would describe the first third of this movie as kind of a slice of life anime, which there are a lot of. And yes, a fantastic element is brought into that. And then later on, the next two thirds are fantastical. But I thought that was really, really enjoyable and quite wholesome. Is The Boy and the Heron my favorite Hayao Miyazaki film of all time? No. But I think it's definitely one of my favorite films of the year. And, it features breathtaking animation, terrific voice acting, obviously the English dubbing. All those voice actors do a great job, from Dee Bautista, Mark Hamill to Christian Bale to Florence Pugh, Robert Pattinson especially. And I think it also serves as another example as to why Miyazaki is one of the best living filmmakers today. He's in a very unique position, where he's able to do what he wants in animation, in a medium. That's kind of a rare thing, when we think of a lot of animated films in the West, it's like, yeah, we do get something like kind of exceptional or something that is so radically different, like Into the Spider-Verse. And that's obvious, like, okay, that movie clearly was made without a lot of like oversight, from Sony. Same thing like Across the Spider-Verse. That was like a film that felt like it was made, where the filmmakers had carte blanche to really do whatever they wanted. Also because it was probably relatively not as expensive to make compared to other animated movies. But like you look at a lot of animated films and it feels like, yeah, there's definitely like an oversight. There's definitely like a lot of structure around these movies. We're here, it just feels like Miyazaki's like, hey, I want to make another movie even though I was been retired for 10 years. Let's go. And they're like, all right, here we go. And he'll spend however long he wants to spend just working on this film, and that shows through. It's very much him. I mean, I guess some aspects of this movie are autobiographical and about his childhood during World War II. And his family and the troubles that his family faced and the adversity that he faces as a child. I think a lot of Miyazaki is in the character of Mahito. And I really like seeing that. It feels like a really so many of his movies are obviously incredibly personal, but like this one especially feels personal. And it's dealing with maybe a lot of the bitterness, the anger, the resentment that he had in his life. And so I appreciate that he kind of opened up and showed that in this film and showed that with this character really does stand out among a lot of his protagonists. And so, yes, I feel like, some of the fantasy mumbo jumbo babble, maybe not as well explained, or it kind of is a little nonsensical at points. And maybe the first third might be a little slow paced, but I wasn't really bothered by the pacing. But other than that, I think this is an exceptionally well-made movie and certainly one of the best movies of the year. So that's my opinions on The Boy and the Heron. What about the rest of you guys? What do you think of the movie? Did you like it as much as I did? Were you more on the negative side? Were you bothered by a number of aspects of it? Or are you more mixed on? Let me know.
5 minutes later.
I mean, the thing is, like, I didn't go to I should have said this in the middle of my review. Usually I would go to the senior citizen screening in the morning, 9 a.m., 9:30 a.m. Sadly, there's not too many screenings of this film, so I had to go see this one in the afternoon. That's why I was running late last night on last night's stream when I was originally going to review this movie. It was packed. There was a lot of people in the theater. A lot of anime fans. Not too many kids. Not too many. That's the one thing I will say. Again, the thing I really appreciate about Japan and Japanese animation is that they don't consider animation just for children. They look at just another medium to tell all sorts of different stories and all sorts of different genres. I really like that. I think that's a really mature way to look at it. I wish that was more the mindset, more the outlook here in America. And certainly in other countries in the West, because I feel like Japan's ahead of the game in terms of what they think about animation. I really like that about them and their filmmaking. This movie's not really for kids. I don't know what this is rated. If this is PG, I would honestly be kind of surprised. This might be PG-13 because there's a lot of violent stuff in this film. There's a lot of disturbing imagery in the movie. There is blood in the movie, which there has been before. It's in terms of tone. I'll tell you this. In terms of tone and violence, this definitely, maybe that's also the reason why I liked this movie so much, is that it's very similar to Princess Mononoke, which does feature blood, which does feature disturbing scene. I mean, which does feature, we see in Princess Mononoke, like people's limbs getting cut off. We see we see one guy get his arms sliced off by like an arrow. They explode off his body. There's some disturbing stuff in this film. And I don't know if this would be great for little kids. As a matter of fact, I don't think it is. Like, this is definitely, if it's not PG-13, it probably should have been. But I like that. I like that it had a very mature tone.